Hi, it's Justin with Spalted Stag Studio. In this video we're going to make a stove cover. The material I purchased for this was a little too wide for my joiner, so I have to start by ripping it down on the bandsaw. Now it's definitely recommended using a bandsaw over a table saw for this. If all you have is a table saw, you can make a jig, but I definitely would not do this without one. If you do, the wood could rock at the wrong moment and you could get a pretty nasty kickback. Once I get it down to size, I'll go ahead and hit it on the joiner. And as you can see, I've had to do some work on this to get it flat, and there is some footage that was cut out because it took so long. So I'm glad I did it on the bandsaw, because I probably would have got smacked in the face if I did it on the table saw. Since I had to take off so much material during the flattening process, I'm just going to take enough off on the planer until I have two parallel sides. Then I'll let it sit for a couple days before I plane it down to the final thickness. And I'm doing this because I just want to see if there's any movement. If there's no movement, I'm good. If there is movement, I'll probably let it sit for a couple more days and we'll go from there. Now this 4/4 cherry is something else. There is so much figure in this wood. I'm almost ashamed to be using it for something of my personal use. This is definitely a piece that should be getting sold. I like to get all four sides square before I actually cut anything down to the final dimensions. And I do this because I just want to make sure that I like the way the grain looks, and depending on what side I have the offcut piece on, it might completely change it. So I'll do this first, double check, make sure everything looks good before I decide which side to cut off on. This also is useful because you'll have a piece that you can use on another project without having to worry about squaring that one up. I always cut my pieces oversized. I just want to make sure I don't get snipe. Most of the time I don't, but on the occasion that I don't compensate for it, I'm probably going to get it and not be able to use the workpiece, so I just always compensate for it. It's not that big of a deal. If I don't get it, I can probably use the offcut piece for another project. Marking my tenons, getting yelled at by the boss. Then I'll go ahead and also mark my locations for my dominoes. This is all pretty straightforward process, although I did make a mistake, and I'll explain that further in the video. As always, I give it a little kissy poo with the hand plane, and this is just going to ensure that you get a seamless glue up. It's one of those things that only takes a couple seconds but gives you a really professional look. The domino is a great tool. It makes the job fast and easy. But with that comes complacency. Because it's so easy to use, I want fast. Since I want fast, I made a big mistake. And it posed to be a huge problem during my glue up. So don't be an idiot like me. No matter how easy and fluid something feels, always take your time. At first the glue up went perfectly fine. It wasn't until the second board that I noticed that there was a massive domino misalignment. And I didn't really get too good a footage of that. And that's not because I don't want you guys to see my mistakes. I would prefer it, that way we can learn how to fix mistakes. Because they happen often. At least for me, because I'm an idiot. But it was kind of a critical situation. We were fighting the dry time on the glue, and I needed all the hands I could get. So the camera operator jumped in and assisted me for this. And we kind of lost the footage in the process. So in the future, I'll try to get better footage of mistakes, that way we can walk through solutions. And thankfully it wasn't off too much. It was enough to make a difference, but I was able to get it to realign with a clamp and a lot of pressure. I gave the 8/4 stock a day, then checked and make sure everything was still flat. Since nothing moved on me, I went ahead and planed it down to its final thickness of 1.5 inches. This was one of the rare instances where I ended up with some snipe, so I went ahead and removed that, and I'll measure it down to the final depth, which is 22 1/4. ripping down the sideboard to 4 inches. I really wish I could have did it smaller, because then I would have been able to center the dowels, but any smaller dimensions just look too awkward against the panel. Okay, I'll go ahead and start my layout for my mortise. I'm just marking where the panel ends, and then I'll center the mortise based off that. I headed to my father's to borrow his mortiser because I don't have one, and realized another mistake. I thought the bits were actually longer than they are, and they're only 2.5 inches. My original plan was for a 3-inch mortise and tenon, which really wasn't too big of a deal. I just had to cut off a little material, and my dowels weren't going to be centered. Now, I honestly don't know why I chose to do the mortise the whole length like this. I could easily just did 3 individual ones, and that would have been sufficient for the project. But for whatever reason, I chose to do this, and it just took forever. But thankfully for you guys, I can fast forward the hell out of it. Which is great, because this was a very tedious process. My arm felt like I was 16 again. I had to do so many passes. Okay, we'll go ahead and cut the tenon now. Unfortunately, my camera ended up changing focus on me, so I apologize for that. I can't really reshoot things. But hey, I used my dado blade for once, and it made this pretty quick, but it reminded me how much I don't like this dado blade. It gives a really uneven cut. I don't know why, it's just the brand, I guess. So once I was done cutting the tenon, I did have to clean it up quite a bit. I used my pull saw to remove a little bit off of each side of the tenon, being real careful not to go too deep and damage the visible portions. And here I'm using the wrong side of the saw to do a rip cut, which is why it's taking forever, but thankfully I realized halfway through and switch it. And again, I'm being real careful not to go too deep or go at a weird angle and damage the visible portion of the board. I'll use the chisel, clean everything up, make it nice and flush, and you can tell I'm thinking real hard because my tongue's sticking out as always. Okay, I'll go ahead and lay out the dowels, which are no longer centered, but it still looked fine. I'll jump over to the drill press, using a 1/2-inch Forstner bit, drill my holes for my dowels. I'll use the same Forstner bit I drilled with to transfer the center of each hole to the breadboard. And here's where the chaos started. I shouldn't have had that clamped together when I made my initial marks. Normally when you do a mortise and tenon, you make a second mark just slightly behind your first and drill that out, and that helps pull it together when you put in your dowels. And here I made another mistake. Normally on a breadboard you want to have your 2 outer holes be oblong. So to accomplish this, you drill slightly off the center of your mark, and then you use a chisel and clean it up and make a nice oval hole. I drilled in the center. So to compensate this, I ended up having to drill 3 holes, which made it a lot wider than it needed to be. And this is a technique that I've used many times. There was no reason for me to make this error, other than the fact that I was rushing. And because I was rushing, I made more than one mistake in this project. And it just goes down to the old saying, if you ain't got enough time to do it right the first time, you're not going to have enough time to fix it. Always take your time. So now that I got the 3 excessive holes drilled for each dowel placement, I'll just use my chisel and square everything up. And you want your hole to hold the dowel tight enough that it'll pull in your board, but loose enough that it's going to allow the panel to expand. And you can find some documents online that will tell you exactly how much your wood is going to expand seasonally. And when you assemble a breadboard, you only want to apply glue in the center areas. And again, that's because we need the outer edges to be able to expand and contract. And here's where things took a catastrophic turn. Now your center dowel, again, is the only dowel you're going to glue in. This is also the one that gave me problems. I could not get this to go in. And once I started hammering it in, it was pretty much no turning back. I had to get it to go through. Now I'm not really sure what caused this dowel to bind. It could have been a misshaping dowel, or my hole could have been off. Either way, when it hit the tenon, it bound and would not budge. I couldn't pull it out, and I was forced to drive it home. By doing this, I ended up blowing out part of the tenon and the bottom of the mortise. So I just applied glue to that, clamped it down, and hoped for the best. The other dowels didn't give me that issue. While hammering away at the other side, I ended up chipping a piece of the tenon on this side. So I just expanded the holes to fit and just went with it. At this point, this is not a project I would have ever sold. But since it's going in my house and it visually looks fine, I'm not too worried about it, because if it doesn't hold up, I can either fix it or turn it into something else. For your outer dowels, you don't want the glue to touch the tenon, so be really careful how you apply the glue and make sure it's only touching your mortise side of your boards. Now that I got that catastrophe handled, I'm going to start sanding. Now, it's not really imperative that these are flush. It does make it easier to sand everything, but again, with seasonal wood movement, it's going to change anyway, so it doesn't have to be flush. Now, you want to get most of your sanding done on the face prior to assembly. And once you get everything glued together, you can just do a light pass with some 220 and clean everything up. Once I finish sanding, I'll use my block plane and take off just a little bit off the corners, just enough of a chamfer so that you don't have a sharp edge. Okay, next up we'll do the handles, and I'm just making a quick mark on the center, and then I'll set up my Craig jig to match that. Now, setting up the Craig jig was kind of a pain. For whatever reason, the handles I purchased were a really weird length, and it didn't line with any of the pre-marked holes on the jig. But once I got it aligned properly, it was easy as can be, and it was a straightforward process. Now, on the bottom of the board, I wanted to countersink my screw heads. But since my fastener bit would have walked, I started off with a drill bit and made it just deep enough cut so that way I could get my fastener bit in there and get a nice flat surface for the screw to rest on. I did that for all 4 holes, and it worked out great. Okay, I'll give it a nice quick sanding, making sure everything's nice and smooth, and then it'll be off to the spray room. Visually, this piece looks absolutely gorgeous. There's so much figure in the cherry. However, I could never sell anything like this. I cannot stand behind how well the breadboard will hold up. But I like to own my mistakes, and since it's just going to my house, it's no big deal. Anyways, thanks for watching, like and subscribe.